It wasn't far past the turn of the country road where one can stumble upon the entrance to an old cemetery that has been long since bathed in mystery. Long ago, the cemetery had seen its final occupants arrive. The tombstone dated some 30 years prior. The cemetery was not on what many would consider to be the beaten path. One might think that the graveyard might fall into a state of disarray. The cemetery instead was a thing of beauty, a forever sanctuary to its occupants and maintained to perfection by an elderly groundskeeper. The cemetery was not large, fitting 300 occupants. The groundskeeper knew the name and location of every occupant, just like he knew his own reflection. He had committed to memory every tombstone committed to his care, and he remembered every date and every epitaph. He was there when the more recent occupants arrived, and when they were lowered into the grave, he was always the one who gave them their covering of soil, believing that committing their bodies to the earth was a sacred task. He worked meticulously to maintain a garden full of beautiful roses, and his garden thrived beyond what any would believe possible. Every morning, as the sun rose over the countryside, the groundskeeper was awake, placing a single rose on the grave of all the 300 occupants. As he greeted each soul, calling them by name. After the sun had set, he would remove the flowers from the grave and bid goodnight to each one of the occupants. Rain or shine, the old groundskeeper worked to maintain the cemetery. Often, he would sing a raspy, slightly off-pitch melody to break the silence that blanketed the old cemetery. Other times, he would weep, for he knew when he was gone, there would be no one to maintain the cemetery. At least not with the same care that he took every single day. As the years passed, fewer and fewer people visited the cemetery, and after a time, there was no one who came to pay their respects. While others gradually lost interest in visiting the old cemetery, the groundskeeper had long since begun to abandon his life behind the cemetery walls. He was no longer interested in the world of the living. There were times when he had to leave to pick up the supplies, and in those moments, his heart felt as empty as one who was forced to leave behind a lover. The old gravedigger cared only about maintaining the cemetery to perfection. Each of the occupants had a special date. At least that's what the groundskeeper called it. He never missed offering a toast to each occupant on their special dates came around every year. He drank to their memory as he knelt in silence next to their grave. One day, the groundskeeper began to feel his body betraying him. As the weeks passed, he began to feel weaker and weaker. But still, he maintained the cemetery to perfection. He vowed to each occupant that he would never leave them, nor allow the cemetery to be unkept. When the groundskeeper finished his work, he turned his attention to the gardener's shed near the entrance of the old cemetery. He emptied it completely, and the next day, though it pained him to do so, he left the cemetery to purchase a truckload of bricks and mortar. Each night, when he had finished tending to his occupants, he worked in the gardener's shed, laying bricks from the floor to the ceiling. He found a piece of wood, into which he carved 3 numbers, crafted to perfection, as was his standard. One morning, his body felt particularly weak. He set roses out on each grave, the way he had done so faithfully for so many decades. He trimmed the grass and the hedges. He worked extra hard, as if fighting each hour as it was slipping away. He picked up every leaf from the ground, wiped away every speck of dust from every tombstone, and he even managed to plant new seeds into the ground, which would soon bear beautiful flowers. As the sun set, he toasted the dead, and then removed the roses from each grave, as he bid each of the residents good night. He looked around at the beautiful cemetery that he had maintained for so many years, and then smiled at his life's works, and his days that had been so well spent. As he sang a quiet melody in his tired, raspy voice, he walked slowly through the moonlight to the gates of the cemetery. He closed them and locked them tight with an old padlock. He then headed to the old gardener's shed. He took the piece of wood that he had spent so many hours carving, hung it on the door of the old shed, which was now completely lined and fortified with bricks. The numbers he carved in the wood read 301. The groundskeeper entered the shed, closed the door behind him, and never emerged again. Yet, to this day, the old cemetery is perfectly beautiful. There are no weeds growing. The flowers flourish. Not a speck of dust covers any of the tombstones. Sometimes, a raspy voice of a man can be heard echoing throughout the countryside. Those who hear it only mistake it for the wind. Nothing more.